They are known as Los Chapitos, the four most trusted sons of the world's most notorious drug kingpin.
After his wife and kids were brutally murdered by a rival cartel hitman, Luis Palma Salazar embarked on a revenge mission that successfully wiped out the killer's entire family. But this wasn't the only time cartel family members got caught in the crossfire. In this special episode, we unwrap some of the most shocking cases revealing when cartels attack rival drug lords' families. Juan Francisco El Brujo Herrera. July 12, 2020. A high-ranking member of the Sinaloa cartel identified as Juan Francisco Herrera, or El Brujo, was brutally murdered alongside his wife and two daughters in Sonora, Mexico. His death allegedly came at the hands of an old-time ally turned enemy, Rafael Caro Quintero, commander of the notorious Caborca cartel. Now, that name might not sound as familiar as other famous cartel bosses in Mexico, but Quintero was a terror in his glory days. To understand how his story aligns with that of El Brujo and the total wipeout of his bloodline, we must go back to the very beginning. From growing his first pot field as a teenager to working with traffickers like Pedro Avilés Perez and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, Quintero built his empire brick by brick, becoming one of the most powerful and influential men of his era. Then in the late 1970s, Quintero formed a collaboration with Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Juan José Esparragosa Moreno, and other notable drug lords to form one of the first fully established criminal groups in Mexico, the Guadalajara Cartel. Quintero has earned himself a reputation as a pioneering figure in the Mexican drug trade, especially thanks to the many dirty jobs he did for the cartel. His nefarious business dealings didn't escape the attention of law enforcement, granting him entry into the infamous FBI Most Wanted list. But the one crime that made him a must-kill or capture target was the murder of DEA agent Enrique Camarena Salazar. November 1984, Mexican authorities armed to the teeth stormed a 2,500-acre ranch known as El Búfalo in the state of Chihuahua. The base belonged to the infamous drug lord Caro Quintero, where he planted, stored, and prepared illegal drugs for distribution into the United States and beyond. The bust was like hitting the jackpot, giving authorities the chance to hit the cartel where it really hurts, because after taking over the ranch, officers then proceeded to burn more than 10,000 tons of pot to ashes. To the officers working that day, it was a major win for the good guys, but for Quintero and his collaborators, that was $160 million lost in a single raid. Of course, raids like this don't just happen without the help of a mole inside the system. Enter Kiki Camarena, a DEA agent working undercover in the Guadalajara cartel, single-handedly responsible for leading authorities to the elusive ranch. Not only did this piss off the Guadalajara cartel, but almost every single drug lord in Mexico. As soon as news got out that Camarena was a government spy, Quintero and other high-ranking members of the Guadalajara cartel kicked off their revenge plan on the DEA by placing a hit on his head. All it took was a couple of months before Camarena and his pilot Alfredo Zavala Avelar were kidnapped in Guadalajara. The day was February 7, 1985, and for the cartel, this was an opportunity to send a loud message to the Mexican authorities. So after capturing Camarena, they took him to a safe house owned by Quintero, located at 881 Lope de Vega in the colonia of Jardines del Bosque. There, he was brutally tortured for hours, beaten and horribly mutilated with different kinds of weapons, before he finally succumbed to the merciful hands of death. Camarena's murder kicked off a huge sandstorm that would soon swallow up everyone involved in his death, as it gave the DEA a good reason to go after some of the top-ranking cartel bosses of the time, including Quintero. April 4th, 1985, Caro Quintero was sleeping in his Costa Rica mansion when a group of armed officers finally caught up to him and placed him under arrest for his involvement in Camarena's murder. Following his extradition back to Mexico, Quintero was sentenced to 40 years in prison, directly taking the fall for the murder like a sacrificial lamb. This long prison term would eventually play a major role in his decision to order the killing of El Brujo and his family. You see, it was under this same Guadalajara cartel that an energetic and passionate young man named Joaquin Archivaldo Guzman, famously known as El Chapo, found his footing in the industry. Starting out as a chauffeur for Felix Gallardo, Quintero's business partner and fellow boss of the Guadalajara cartel, El Chapo slowly rose in ranks, gaining trust and carrying out heavy hits for the cartel. Seeing his dedication to the game and his ability to produce results, Gallardo began delegating even more responsibilities to El Chapo, entrusting him with handling the logistics for shipments coming from Colombia into Mexico by air, land, and sea. After Quintero and other top Guadalajara leaders were arrested and sent to prison, fellow drug lord Felix Gallardo decided it was best to go underground to protect his family, so the trade and turfs were divided into splinters to make law enforcement crackdowns a lot harder. Taking control of the Pacific Coast operation was El Chapo and Ismael Zambada Garcia, who built a new operation known as the Sinaloa Cartel. But how did Quintero's story get intertwined with El Brujo, and why did he order his execution? Well, it all boils down to the capture of El Chapo and a feud no one saw coming between Rafael Quintero and El Chapo's sons. You see, while El Chapo was on the throne, he enjoyed unwavering support from Quintero and his family, who carried out hit upon hit to help further his ambition, and together they built what used to be the most powerful drug empire in all of Mexico. Everything changed after El Chapo was finally captured by Mexican forces on January 8, 2016, and his children, known as the Los Chopitos, took control of the business. Tensions began rising between El Chapo's Sinaloa cartel and Quintero's faction, known as the Caborca cartel. This brewing conflict reached a peak in July 2020, when Quintero's nephew, Santiago Eduardo, was brutally murdered in Culiacan by men from the Los Chopitos faction. With the murder of a member of his family, Quintero's loyalty to the Sinaloa cartel was now totally severed, and the only thing on his mind was revenge. His target was one of Sinaloa's most trusted hitmen, Juan Francisco Herrera. July 12, 2020, El Brujo was driving with his wife, Nayeli, and his 2 daughters in Sonora, Mexico, when they were suddenly ambushed by a taxi filled with a dozen gunmen armed with military-grade weapons. Without asking any questions, the assailants fired indiscriminately into the vehicle. And as El Brujo got hit, he lost control of the vehicle and crashed into a pole. Just like that, his entire family was wiped out in one fell swoop. When officers finally arrived on the scene, they discovered bodies riddled with hundreds of bullets, showing zero chance of survival. No one had to really look far to identify the culprit, as there were telltale signs this was a reprisal attack from Rafael Quintero's Caborca cartel. After taking dozens of lives on behalf of the Sinaloa cartel, helping the gang rise to power, and even collaborating with them to bring down their latest rival, the CJNG, Quintero was devastated that the same Sinaloa cartel would order a hit on his own nephew, so he went blood got blood. But Quintero wasn't the only cartel boss who had to mourn his family. Even El Chapo himself wasn't spared from the onslaught of violence, especially when the victim in question was his son. Edgar Guzman Lopez. May 10, 2008. Edgar Guzman Lopez was on his way back from a lucrative drug deal when he casually drove into an ambush laid by a rival cartel, losing his life in the process. But before this young man was brutally murdered, he was on his way to inheriting the multi-billion-dollar operation his father had built and protected for decades. Born on the 30th of May, 1986, Edgar was one of El Chapo's favorite sons. His mother was Griselda Lopez Perez, and just like his other brothers, his upbringing was rooted in the Mexican drug business. But while El Chapo introduced most of his sons to the life of crime at an early age, Edgar was kept out of the family business until he completed his education. That turned out to be El Chapo's biggest mistake. Without waiting to learn the ropes from his father, Edgar attempted to create his own path in the drug trafficking industry. By 2008, he had grown his first gram of white powder, leading to his final decision to do business with the cartel. But at the time Edgar dipped his foot in the waters, the Guzman family had become a major target for both law enforcement and rival cartels. The streets were dangerous for El Chapo and his sons. Even though they literally ran those streets, dozens of idle guns were waiting to fire the shot that would end the life of El Chapo himself or any of his sons. However, Edgar was hot-headed, and his passion for making a name for himself pushed him to make the wrong decisions. Discarding his father's stay-at-home order, the young drug trafficker teamed up with his friend Arturo Mesa Cazares to embark on a trip to Chicago, Illinois, with his self-made bricks of white powder. The risk was high, but so was the reward, and thanks to his own acquired street smarts, Edgar successfully made the sale before hopping on a flight back to Mexico with Mesa. But in all their planning, Edgar and his friend forgot to perfect their re-entry logistics, because while getting out of Mexico was breezy, getting back to his father's base in Culiacan was extremely risky. Rival gangs were trying to settle scores, authorities needed a scapegoat from El Chapo's families, and the streets were definitely not safe for the son of El Chapo himself. That night, while trying to sneak into the territories of Culiacan and make his way home, Edgar Guzman was attacked in his red SUV by a group of armed gunmen, who opened fire and brutally murdered the young man. Over 500 bullets riddled the vehicle, leaving both Edgar and Mesa barely recognizable. But while most observers blamed the Beltran-Leyva cartel, one of the Sinaloa's most powerful rivals for the shooting, the story wasn't exactly that straightforward. You see, contrary to other cases of cartel killings where the attackers were either rival cartels or the Mexican forces, rumors began to swirl that it was El Chapo's men who actually murdered Edgar by accident. This is where we introduced a new character in the whole story, a cartel hitman named Gonzalo Inzunza, or El Macho Prieto. But why did El Macho, one of the Sinaloa's most prominent hitmen, break the cardinal rule of the cartel business by carrying out a forbidden hit on El Chapo's chosen successor? Unraveling this mystery takes us to the very genesis of Inunza's history with the Sinaloa cartel. Remember how the Pacific Coast operation of the Guadalajara cartel was handed over to El Chapo and his partner Ismael Zambada, also known as El Mayo? Well, it was through this El Mayo that Inunza first found work in the Sinaloa cartel as his chief assassin. Under El Mayo, the head sicario led many deadly operations in Culiacan and other regions across Sinaloa, as the cartel waged war on its other rival, fighting for land, trade routes, and complete domination of the industry. Known for operating with absolute impunity, El Macho's fame spread beyond the lands his own feet had stamped, as news of his brutal killing methods and beastly thirst for violence became household news. Going by the records kept by the Mexican authorities, he's believed to have been personally responsible for over 80 murders, which included the targeted shootings of police officers who weren't willing to be bribed, and those who just found themselves at the wrong place at the wrong time. Inunza was deadly, and his bloody rampage advanced the Sinaloa cartel in leaps and bounds. He was gaining territories, beating cartels into subjection, quelling any revolt against El Chapo and El Mayo, and played a huge role in pushing the Sinaloa cartel to become one of the most dangerous criminal enterprises to ever emerge in Mexico. But even though his acts were brazenly done, and he never hid his identity as a cold-blooded killer, the law could not hold him for too long. Many times Inzunza avoided going to prison, and many more times he intimidated law enforcement and showed them he was indeed above the law. For example, in the 1990s, 2 patrol cars from the Federal Ministerial Police, or PFM, crossed into a neighborhood where Inzunza was staying to serve an arrest warrant. It turned out to be a big mistake and a huge slap on the face of the entire police force. Because even though the officer's visit had nothing to do with the hitman, and the person in question wasn't even one of his men, El Mencho seized the opportunity to showcase his power. As the officers drove in, they were approached by a group of gunmen who forced them to stop and call their boss. What happened next played out like a scene from a Hollywood blockbuster. As soon as the police commander arrived at the scene minutes later, El Mencho walked up to him and smacked him several times, telling him he had no permission to be in his territory and warning him and his men from ever setting foot in his home base ever again. It didn't end there, though, because after the drug lord ordered them to leave, El Mencho's men then took their weapons, holding them for a couple of days before eventually returning them to the disgraced officers. He was unstoppable for a very long time, but the end of his reign started when he killed the beloved son of his boss by accident. You see, at the time of Edgar's death, the Sinaloa cartel was in the middle of an internal power struggle with the Beltran Leyva cartel, headed by drug kingpin Alfredo Beltran Leyva. Tensions between the two cartels reached a new height in January 2008 when Alfredo was captured by the Mexican army. Due to El Chapo's alliance with the Mexican government, the Leyva brothers Arturo, Carlos, and Hector became extremely suspicious of his involvement in their brother's capture. They believed he sold them out to the feds, and they weren't going to let that slide. As violence erupted between the two cartels, El Macho was at the forefront, defending the Sinaloa cartel and its territories with ferocity. But on the day Edgar chose to crawl back into Culiacan, the Beltran Leyva cartel got the upper hand. Their perfectly laid ambush caught El Chapo's son in his most vulnerable position, and he was brutally murdered. This official version of events was publicized by the media and sponsored by the cartels, but those who really knew what happened that day tell a different story. In this alternate plotline, Inzunza had actually mistaken Edgar for a member of the Beltran Leyva and opened fire, and with that single mistake, he indirectly signed his own death warrant. Of course, he instantly lost the blanket of protection he enjoyed from El Mayo, exposing him to the wrath of El Chapo's sicarios, who were hunting him like a game. However, his death would not later come at the hands of the cartel. Instead, he was fatally shot in a gunfight with the Mexican Marines on the 18th December, 2013. Hector Luis Palma Salazar. While the story of drug lords and sicarios like El Chapo and El Mencho are known by many, the underground scene is filled with men whose infamy is often confined to the dark depths of the drug trade. One of such men is Jesus Hector Luis Palma Salazar, a prolific gunman for the Guadalajara cartel, whose family got wiped out in one single day. Palma's journey into the world of crime began quite early in his life, when he began stealing cars before finally coming into the employ of Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo of the Guadalajara cartel. Known to be a cold-blooded killer, Palma's thirst for blood paved his way to the top, and in later years, he became named as the co-leader of the cartel. His business activities also brought him in contact with El Chapo and El Mayo, and on one occasion, the two almost lost their lives. For example, in 1988, Palma and his partner, El Lobito Retamosa, lost a large shipment of white powder, and as punishment, El Lobito was murdered, while Palma and El Chapo were spared. But tragedy struck Palma after he returned from serving jail term in Arizona, only to discover that his wife, Guadalupe Leja Serrano, had run off with Venezuelan trafficker Rafael Enrique Clavel, along with their two children. After forcing Guadalupe to withdraw $7 million from a bank account, Clavel would later decapitate her before shipping her head back to Palma in a box as insult to injury. As for the two children, Jesus and Natalie, Clavel drove them to a remote bridge named Puente de la Concordia, located in the city of San Cristobal, Táchira, some 40 kilometers from the border with Colombia, and tossed them into the waters. Back home, Palma was devastated both by his wife's shocking betrayal and her sudden death, and in revenge, he executed Gallardo's lawyers. Then he began a string of revenge killings, starting with all three of Clavel's children, and then moving on to almost every single member of his family. Whether by luck or perfect timing, Clavel was soon apprehended by authorities for murdering the two children, narrowly avoiding Palma's rampage. But just when he thought he was now in a safe space where the cartel boss couldn't touch him, Palma ordered his execution in jail, using his men on the inside. This vengeful streak of violence has become one of the most horrific stories of cartel wiping out rival families out of anger, vengeance, and the desire for power. Before we go on with the rest of the video, here's our subscribers' pick for today. In the dark and turbulent world of cartels, Several haunting stories have emerged of cartels attacking rival drug lords' families. As the turf war in Mexico rages on and on, many family members have become collateral damage, lost to a senseless display of violence that has claimed thousands of lives for several decades. As these cartel bosses hand over the family business to their children, the tradition continues, and violence continues to tear through the streets and corners of the nation. To even and settle scores, these gangs kidnap the wives of drug lords, torture their kids, and murder their extended families. Much like with the story of Guadalupe, wife of Palma Salazar, who got killed and dismembered by the man she trusted over her husband. Do you believe that families of drug lords deserve the brutal punishment they face at the hands of rival gangs? Or should they be exonerated, especially when they don't actively participate in the trade and violence? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section down below. Now, let's get back to the video. Cesar Carrillo Leyva. On a dark and gloomy day in August 2020, Amado Carrillo's son, Cesar Carrillo Leyva, was murdered in cold blood by Los Chopitos sicarios. But who was this young man, and how did he become a huge target for the cartel? No one knew Cesar existed until 2011, when several banners suddenly appeared around the state of Chihuahua, announcing the emergence of the new Juarez cartel and stating that Cesar was now in control of the criminal group. As the second child of one of Mexico's most dreaded drug lords, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, also known as Lord of the Skies, Cesar grew up in secret, with many details about his upbringing shielded from the public eye. His father, Amado Carrillo, was a hardened criminal who managed to evade capture from both Mexican and United States authorities by staying low-key. His methods kept money flowing into his pocket, while also shielding him from any run-ins with the law. As one of the first traffickers to transport shipments of white powder using fleets of airplanes, Amado Carrillo earned his iconic nickname and built a multi-million-dollar fortune for himself. His sudden death came on July 4, 1997, while he was undergoing plastic surgery in a Santa Monica hospital. As soon as Cesar took control of the cartel, he became a walking target for all rival gangs seeking to destroy the new Juarez cartel. His day of reckoning came in August 2020, when gunmen opened fire on him in the municipality of Novelado in Sinaloa. According to eyewitness accounts, the murder occurred around 9:15 p.m. in the Alfonso G. Calderon neighborhood when gunshots began ringing in the vicinity. Residents immediately contacted the police, who arrived at the scene only to find Cesar's bullet-ridden body inside his garage. Those who saw the events play out claimed that the two hitmen had actually been waiting for him at home that night, so as soon as he showed up, they opened fire and took him out. Going by the reports broadcasted by local journalists, the hit was reportedly ordered by El Chapo's sons, known as the Los Chopitos. The war between the Sinaloa and the Juarez cartel is not a new story, but this murder remains one of the most pivotal moments of the war, as it gave the Sinaloa strategic advantage. As always, no one was ever arrested or prosecuted for Cesar's murder, and the two men seen by witnesses were never identified. Edgar Guzman. When Edgar Guzman stepped out for Mexico's Independence Day celebration, he probably had no idea this would be his last day alive. The 36-year-old was one of El Chapo's surviving nephews and one of the main figures in the cartel. But while attending a party in the northern state of Chihuahua, a couple of gunmen sighted him and opened a rain of bullets, hitting him multiple times. As soon as the deed was done, the men disappeared into the crowd. And even though paramedics attempted to rush Edel to the nearest medical facility, all attempts to save his life failed, and he was declared dead. Due to his blood ties with El Chapo, news of Edel's death spread like wildfire, proving that even the families of powerful cartel members don't enjoy immunity from the violence that's an ingrained part of the drug game. Thank you for watching this video. See you in the next one.